Elliot Baker had been working as a surgeon for about 25 years. During this time, the talented surgeon managed to save many lives, which significantly expanded the circle of his acquaintances, not only in Maine, but also beyond its borders. Elliot is known for his professionalism and composure, which became the hallmark of his work. He could easily go to work on his day off in order to fill in for a sick colleague. That was mainly due to the fact that he was single and didn't have any children, so he lived alone in his small house in Main Street. Elliot's wife died over 10 years ago, which the man took very hard. Ever since then, he'd been spending almost all of his free time at work. Staying late at the hospital, Elliot deliberately avoided going home, where all that was waiting for him was a cold bed, an empty refrigerator, and an old photo album full of pictures of his beloved wife. Elliot could never get remarried because he always considered himself a one-woman man who, like the graceful swans, could only have one partner in his lifetime. The talented surgeon had few friends, and the only one he could single out was Jacob Wright, who worked in the surgical department under his management. Elliot remembered well the first time Jacob came into the hospital, about to start his residency. Elliot was always great at reading people, and therefore he immediately singled Jacob out from the entire group of new residents. With Elliot's direct support, the young surgeon gained experience, and in the opinion of the senior mentor, would one day be able to replace him. Of course, that didn't mean that Elliot was the only one who could perform surgeries at the hospital. Nevertheless, a specialist at his level with such extensive work experience was always in great demand, and therefore the hospital management tried to encourage him in every possible way. But that day was an exception to the rule, because Elliot had to perform two extremely difficult surgeries, one after the other. Going home in his old Ford, the surgeon struggled desperately to even stay awake, which made it exceptionally hard for him to concentrate on the road. Winter that year was unusually mild. There were no severe colds and very little snow. Elliot drove down a deserted, winding road which went close to the forest. The man couldn't help but admire the beauty of the trees and shrubs powdered with snow. Suddenly, a dark spot appeared on the road, which immediately attracted Elliot's attention. "What is that?" the man whispered in surprise. The strange object on the road was getting bigger as Elliot drove closer, and eventually the man had to hit the brakes. The car stopped as if rooted to the spot. It was only then that the surgeon realized that some kind of animal was standing in front of him. Taking a closer look, Elliot gasped, "That's a moose." Meanwhile, the massive animal shook its branched antlers, after which it bent over some strange object laying on the road. Seeing that the moose wasn't going to leave, Elliot pressed on the horn a couple of times, after which the animal reluctantly disappeared into the nearby bushes. Now that the road was clear, the surgeon could continue on his way. But at that moment, Elliot got a strange feeling. For some inexplicable reason, the man simply couldn't move. There was obviously something else still lying on the road, and the surgeon realized that he needed to check out what it was before driving on. Having gotten out of his warm car, Elliot went over to the spot where the moose had just stood and clutched his head, unable to believe his eyes. There was a person lying on the icy road, just a few yards away from the surgeon's Ford. Running up to the body sprawled on the pavement, Elliot saw a young woman without a coat. The stranger was wearing thin, almost weightless pajamas and indoor slippers. Despite the fact that the temperature outside wasn't lower than 26 degrees, the woman was still dressed very inappropriately for the weather. But the worst part was that during quick initial examination, the surgeon found a wound on the woman's head, which was probably what caused her to collapse right in the middle of the road. Having checked the woman's pulse, Elliot shuddered. She was alive. Realizing that he couldn't waste another second, the surgeon picked the stranger up and carried her to his car. Of course, Elliot could have called an ambulance, but he'd get her to a hospital sooner than the ambulance would arrive. The young woman was still unconscious, which allowed the surgeon to take her place in the back seat of his car without any resistance. A minute later, Elliot was already on the same route he just took from the hospital. The man knew that Jacob was on call at the hospital, and he definitely wouldn't refuse to help his mentor. All this time, the woman was unconscious, which worried Elliot a lot. Needless to say, the nurses in the emergency room were extremely surprised to see one of the hospital's best surgeons literally carrying in a half-naked woman with a bloody wound on her head. "I didn't run her over, if that's what you're thinking," Elliot said as soon as he saw the wary looks of the hospital staff. "Of course not. We weren't thinking that, Dr. Baker. It's just that it does look strange. Why didn't you call an ambulance?" The nurse stuttered. Elliot brushed her off and asked her to prep the woman for examination. The surgeon understood that Jacob could easily handle the cut on the back of the stranger's head without his help. Moreover, after everything he'd been through that day, the man could barely stand on his feet, so he decided to take a nap in his office for a couple of hours. "But who is she, this patient?" Dr. Jacob asked Elliot. "I don't know. I found her in the middle of the road. She wasn't wearing anything else. I think that we need to call the police, treat the wound on her head in the meantime, and run all the tests. I need to take a quick nap or I'm going to end up passed out too," Elliot said, patting his colleague on the shoulder. Plunging into an anxious, light sleep on the sofa in his office, the surgeon was sure that Jacob would handle the situation perfectly. Unfortunately, Elliot wasn't destined to enjoy his rest, because an hour later, Jacob came in and woke him up. "Dr. Baker, wake up!" The young surgeon was shaking his mentor by the shoulder. "What is it? Is it morning already? Or can't you handle a minor cut on the woman's head?" Elliot asked, stretching sleepily. "That's not it. It's actually more complicated. Her head injury isn't her biggest problem. The patient's kidneys are failing. She needs an urgent transplant, or she won't make it," Jacob blurted out quickly. "What? Her kidneys? But how did she end up on the road in her pajamas?" Jacob exclaimed in surprise. His colleague just shrugged his shoulders, thus making it clear that he had no idea what was going on. This case got more mysterious by the second, which couldn't but worry Elliot, who felt responsible for the life of the young woman he'd found. The police arrived early in the morning. They interrogated the surgeon and wrote down his testimony. The officers examined the bumper on Elliot's car and found that there was no sign of dents or bumps, which made it clear that it hadn't been in an accident. "Well, now that the police are involved in the case, we'll be able to find out the name of this woman and whether she has relatives that can donate her a kidney." Elliot breathed a sigh of relief. At that moment, the man couldn't have even suspected that life had another surprise in store for him. It all started with a call from Elliot's neighbor, who informed the surgeon that his house had burned to the ground last night. "What do you mean it burned down?" the man asked in a trembling voice. "The firefighters said that it was a gas leak, which denoted from a spark in the wiring. It's extremely fortunate that there was no one home at the time," Mrs. Parker explained. Elliot turned pale as he realized that the strange woman had inadvertently saved his life. After all, if the surgeon hadn't found her on the road and taken her to the hospital, he would have definitely been at home at the time of the explosion and most likely would have died in it. "This morning just keeps getting better," the surgeon whispered, hanging up the phone. Having learned about his colleague's problem, Jacob immediately offered his help. "Dr. Baker, sir, I live alone and there's definitely enough room for another person in my house," the young man suggested cautiously. "All right, let's talk about it later. Right now we need to deal with our patient. Did the police find her next of kin?" Elliot asked warily. Jacob sighed sadly and shook his head. The young surgeon preferred not to get involved with the police, knowing full well that they could handle the case on their own. All this time, Elliot couldn't stop thinking about his patient, who'd been in a coma ever since he'd brought her to the hospital. Apparently, her condition wasn't caused by the head injury, but was brought about by her kidney disease. Elliot was well aware that she would have to wait for years on the donor list, which meant that she had no chance. The surgeon couldn't understand why he'd care so much about this stranger. After all, during the years he'd been working at the hospital, Elliot got to see all kinds of devastating situations, but he'd always managed to handle them. At that moment, a very unexpected thought crawled into the surgeon's head and seemed to have completely taken over his mind. Since Elliot didn't have a family, it wouldn't be that big of a deal to donate one of his kidneys to his patients. Of course, it would be illegal unless the surgeon filled in a lot of paperwork to make his donation legitimate, but he didn't have the time for that. What do I have to lose? I don't have any kids, my house literally burned down, the best years of my life have clearly passed, and I could still live a normal life with one kidney, but the second one could save the life of this young woman, Elliot Baker thought. But when he voiced his idea to Jacob, the young surgeon shook his head. No, the chief won't allow it. It's too risky. You know as well as I do that the best option is to get a relative to donate their organ, and you two aren't related, Jacob added. But it was simply impossible to change Elliot's mind. The man had already ordered the tests to see if he was a match, and the results clearly showed that he could be the woman's donor. At the same time, the lab tech who did the blood work noticed that Elliot and the unidentified woman had similar blood, as if they were related. If I didn't know for sure that she wasn't your daughter, I would have assumed that you two were related, the technician said to the surgeon, smiling. Maybe that's my purpose in life. My late wife and I tried to have children so many times, but all to no avail. My Rose couldn't carry a child. We even thought about adopting, but it wasn't in the cards for us. I started going to church back then, and even donated my genetic material so that I could help someone else have children, Elliot admitted to Jacob. The young surgeon knew about his senior colleague's problems, and therefore he always tried to avoid this subject so as to not hurt the widower. But now he saw Elliot from a completely different side. Of course, Jacob understood that if he were to help Elliot, he'd be taking a huge risk. However, it didn't mean that he'd need to perform the transplant surgery on his own. They would bring in a transplant specialist who owed his career in the prestigious hospital to Elliot. It was him that Elliot Baker turned to for help when he decided to save the young woman at all costs. They decided to do the surgery at night so as to avoid a confrontation from the chief or the police, who could come to the hospital at any moment. Watching the pre-op process, Jacob caught himself thinking that it was all just a bad dream, and that as soon as he opened his eyes, the stranger would be gone and Elliot wouldn't be giving her his kidney. Fortunately, the transplant surgery was successful. According to the transplant surgeon, there were no signs that the recipient might reject the organ. This is the first time I've seen something like this. Are you sure you two aren't related? Asked the doctor who performed the transplant surgery. I don't know, Duncan. I did send our blood samples for a DNA test, just in case. But frankly, I doubt that we could be related. I hope this will stay between us, Elliot replied quietly. The fact was that the man hadn't yet fully recovered from the anesthesia, and it was still very hard for him to speak. About an hour later, the chief of surgery, Margaret Rodman, burst into the room. What the heck is going on here, Elliot? Are you trying to get the hospital sued? Did you even think about what were to happen if something were to go wrong? I could lose my license, and not just me, but everyone who works here. The woman was very angry. But Elliot simply accepted her outrage and didn't argue. Deep down, he knew he did the right thing by saving his patient's life, and that it might definitely bring him a good future. Chief Rodman paused for a bit, and then informed Elliot that he was retroactively fired from the hospital. Jacob was standing next to him and immediately turned pale. Least of all, he expected things to go down this way. Elliot had spent most of his life working for this hospital, and now he'd just been tossed out into the street like an unwanted dog. But as it turned out later, this wasn't the last news of that very eventful day. After the chief left, the police came into Elliot's room. They managed to identify the young woman. Her name was Jennifer King. She was a 26-year-old writer from a small town located in northern Maine. The woman didn't have a father, and she lived with a sick mother who always had kidney problems. It was for this very reason that she couldn't have become her daughter's donor. The police didn't rest until they found the person responsible for what had happened to Jennifer that night, and their hard work paid off. As it turned out, Jennifer decided to rent a house at the edge of the forest so she could rest there and get started on her new novel. It was there that she was attacked by a fugitive prisoner who dug a tunnel out of his cell and escaped from the state county jail. Thanks to the timeless actions of the police, the fugitive was detained and quickly confessed to his crime. Jennifer King. This name doesn't mean anything to me, Elliot whispered, repeating it over and over again. Since the surgeon was still weak after his surgery, he decided to spend another day at the hospital, and for the first time in his life, get to experience it as a patient and not the attending physician. By noon, the DNA test came back and shook the entire hospital. With a probability of 99.9%, Jennifer King was Elliot Baker's daughter. When he heard the news, Jacob was speechless, while the newly minted father breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you, God, for the fact that I did something right in my life. During the years I couldn't have had my own children, I donated so much genetic material that hopefully I gave many women a chance to experience motherhood. But I never even hoped that I'd ever get to meet one of my biological children, the surgeon said. The chances that he would get to meet his child accidentally were very slim, but they did happen. Jennifer King woke up 2 days later, and for the first time in months, she wasn't in pain. Her father's donor kidney was a perfect match, which was confirmed by the test results. The story of the miraculous recovery of the previously unidentified woman was quickly picked up by the journalists, who told the whole state what had happened down to the smallest detail. The father and daughter left the hospital soon. Leading Jennifer by the arm, Elliot was on cloud 9. Now the man had a daughter, and even though she was already an adult, she was still his only relative that he knew of. Well, all I'd like to say now is that the ways of the Lord are inscrutable, and that the good we do in our lives will definitely come back to us eventually.